In this video, we're going to begin covering the geometry primitives, how to create them, and how to work with them. Now, this video is a little longer than all the previous videos so far, so make sure you take your time, slow things down, and take notes, and maybe rewatch certain parts of this video over again so you understand how to work with objects in Maya. And these 17 videos that are released for free are from Module 1 of Maya Foundation Homesteader course. There are 2 more modules for a total of 65 videos in 18 hours that will show you how to use Maya for modeling and for UVing so you can begin to create your own environment assets. And if you want to do a deep dive, get the Maya Foundation Homesteader course to get Module 2 and Module 3. And now let's continue with the tutorial. Now, there are 2 things you should know about. There are 2 different types of objects that you tend to work with in Maya. Most of the time you are working with polygons, and that's what we are going to be working with. Polygons is a type of geometry, and for environment art, for games, polygons is going to be your go-to. However, there is another type of geometry called NURBS, and it's just a different type of geometry. It's a little bit more difficult to work with. It's not as common, but it is used for certain specific production pipelines. But again, it's not very often used. For us, we are going to be working entirely with polygons. To show you what those 2 options are, and specifically and mainly polygons, if you go to create, right under objects right here, you have ability to create NURB primitives and then polygon primitives. And this is what we're going to be sticking with for the rest of this course. So there are 2 places where you can create polygon primitives inside your scene. The first one, of course, is the create drop-down menu, polygon primitives. The second way is to use Maya given shelf. So if you switch over to poly modeling right here, this will give you access to some of those primitives that are available in the drop-down menu, and they're going to be right here. So you can use the drop-down menu or you can use Maya given shelf. If you happen to not see this shelf and it's completely gone, you'd have to go to the Windows, UI elements, and make sure that you have shelf enabled. So for right now, let's go ahead and peel off the polygon primitives menu. So I'm going to go to create polygon primitives, and I'm just going to click on this bar so it's a floating window. And there are a lot of polygon primitives we can start to create from. Now, your most go-to primitives are going to be simple geometric shapes. These are going to be sphere, cube, cylinder, and a plane. The rest of them are usually not used. There are times where you may need to use, for example, a pipe. It's a nice rounded cylindrical shape with a hole in the middle. But the rest of them are nice to have, but I don't find myself actually using them for anything to start with. The reason these polygon primitives are very important is because they are your beginning objects. This is what most of your geometry will start from. You will insert a sphere, a cube, a cylinder, a plane, and these are going to be your beginning parts of modeling the object. Sometimes you just use one, sometimes you use a combination of multiple polygon primitives to create your models. So let's go ahead and insert just one. So let's start with just a regular sphere. With a left click, and this will insert an object and create it inside your scene. If I go ahead and left click on any of the other primitives, for example, a cylinder, we'll have a cylinder created. And if I go ahead and create, let's say, a cube, I'll have a cube created. Now, I've just created 3 objects. All of those 3 objects are now on top of each other. They still exist inside the world. It's just some of them are smaller and others are bigger. But I do have now 3 objects inside the scene. To select objects inside your scene, you simply hover your mouse over it and left click. This will select the object. Now I have other objects inside here, and if you can see them, they will be selected as well. So here is a sphere, and there's also a cube inside there. Now to deselect any selected object, you just left click in the empty space, and this will deselect it. Now whenever you have multiple objects inside the scene, you can use the outliner for a full list of all your objects inside your scene and ability for you to select them individually. So again, to open up the outliner, you go on the left hand side right here. This is going to be the last icon, and you toggle the outliner to show or hide. And here are going to be your 3 objects that we just created: sphere, cylinder, and cube. And if you select and left click on each one inside the outliner, that will also be selected inside your scene. And again, if you left click off an empty space, they will be deselected. If you want to select an object and then delete it or remove an object that you created, you simply need to select it first. So let's say I want to go ahead and select the cube. It is selected. I just can't see it. Let's select the cylinder. And then to remove it completely from the scene, you just hit delete and that object will be removed. If you want to undo any operation you just did, the universal shortcut key is Ctrl Z. So if you hit Ctrl Z, this will bring the cylinder or whatever you just did and it will undo it. You can access undo under edit, undo, and there's also redo. Ctrl Z for undo, Ctrl Y for redo. Alright, let's go ahead and close the outliner. And I'm going to close this Polygon Primitives menu as well. Now let's cover how to move objects, how to scale them, how to rotate them inside the scene. So by default, whenever you select an object, you'll see that there are no gizmos show up. That means we are only using the selection mode at the moment. And if I just continue to select the objects, I won't be able to move, rotate, or scale them, but I'll just be able to select them. The reason for this is because we have the select tool enabled. Select tool is Q on a keyboard. That's the shortcut key. And you'll see the arrow right here on the left hand side in the toolbox, the select tool. That's what we have available. That's why we are selecting objects and no gizmo shows up for us to move, rotate, or scale. If you want to start moving objects, select the object and come over here on the left hand side and enable the move tool. The shortcut key is W. As soon as you hit W, a gizmo, XYZ Gizmo will show up. And to move that object, all you have to do is hover over any of the arrows. And as soon as you do, you can see that arrow lights up. And then you can left click, hold, and drag to move that object along that axis. Let me go ahead and zoom in, a little closer, Alt, right mouse click. If you hover your mouse right in the center, there's going to be a universal XYZ Gizmo. This will allow you to move an object in all three axes. Now, usually you don't do this inside the perspective viewport. Usually you only move an object on a single axis, on a single direction arrow. This is a little bit more precise way of moving objects inside the perspective viewport. Otherwise, you are moving your object in XYZ all together, and it's always relative to the camera you're looking at. So let's go ahead and take this cylinder and move it out of the way. Now let's take a look at other couple of options. So I'm going to select the sphere and let's switch over to rotate. The shortcut key for rotate is E, or you can click on this icon in the toolbox. As soon as you do that, you can see the gizmo changes. And actually, let me go ahead and select the cube. Let's select the cube. I'm going to close the outliner and I'm going to hit W to move it. And then I'm going to switch to rotate. Just makes it easier for us to see what rotation will look like on the cube. And then you can do the same thing. You just hover over an axis on which you want to rotate on. You can see they become highlighted when you hover over them. And then you just left click, hold, and drag, and you will begin to rotate. And then the rotate will have a blue or light blue universal XYZ rotation, and it'll allow you to rotate in like in almost like 3 directions based on the camera. But again, just as with the move tool, you tend to stick with one rotation at a time for more precision, rather than trying to rotate based on the camera or on XYZ together. And then your third operation is your scale. So let's go ahead and select the cylinder or the sphere and then switch over to the scale tool. The shortcut key is going to be R, and you can see the gizmo changes as well. So now you are inside the scale gizmo, the scale transformation. And then all you need to do is you just left click, hold, and drag on any of these boxes to scale along that specific axis on X, Y, or Z. Or in many cases, you will scale on X, Y, Z together by hovering and placing your mouse right in the center on that blue box. And left click, hold, and drag. This will uniformly scale an object. And this is very often done. You do want to scale most of the time uniformly. Let me go ahead and enable wireframe unshaded, Alt 5. Start using some of the shortcut keys we've covered. And using these 3 shortcut keys, W for move, E for rotate, R for scale, are your quick access buttons. You should get to know them very quickly, so that way you can begin and quickly change from one operation transformation to another on the fly. W for move, E for rotate, R for scale. To select multiple objects at the same time or remove something from a selection. So let's say we have these 3 objects and I want to have them selected all together. If you left click, hold and drag outside an empty space, this will give you a kind of a marquee selection. And this will select all the objects all at the same time. If you want to deselect them, you just left click in the empty space. If you want to be a little bit more precise about your selections, you can left click on one, then hold Shift, left click on a second object. This will add to a selection, and then continue holding Shift and left clicking to add to a selection. If you want to remove from a selection, you can continue holding down Shift and just click on the object again. This will kind of toggle to select it and then deselect it. And there is another option to remove from a selection only by holding down Control. So Shift will always toggle, but Control will only remove from a selection. Now let's go ahead and cover a little bit of the sizes and some options for each primitive that you create. I'm going to go ahead and delete them all I'm going to marquee select them, left click, hold and drag, and then hit delete. And let's create a cube. I'm going to go to Poly Model and Shelf now and just click on the cube icon and recreate the cube. Whenever you create an object, you have an option of just simply taking this object and moving, rotating, as well as scaling. Every time you do this, if you take a look at the channel box, the selected object will be displayed with all the transform and all the options, and it will begin to remember the translation, the rotation, and the scale that you just did. So you can take a look at here on the right hand side. I have channel box available and it's displaying. If you have something else, you just switch over to the channel box. And you can see that translate, rotate, and scale options have been changed. By default, here's what they're going to look like. Everything will be set to 0 except for scale. These are the default options. And then anytime you start doing something to the object, the transformations will be recorded. So let me go ahead and move this again, scale it, rotate it. So that means you can go ahead and scale, rotate, and move the object in the world space inside the viewport, or you can also type in the number to make those transformations for the object as well. So for example, if I knew that I had to rotate this object at a specific axis, let's say I'm rotating this, I can take a look at the rotate. I can see that it's rotating on Z at negative value. So if I want a perfect 90-degree or 45-degree rotation, I can come in here and I can type in negative 45, for example. And if I was going to rotate maybe this way, and I can see that it's now rotating on X, I can do, let's say, 90-degree rotation or 45 or whatever. So I can type in numbers here, as well as for translate. I can type in values here. So for example, if I wanted to move it somewhere on X, that many units, I could type in the number, let's say -5, it will be moved. As well as for scale, I can type in a number here as well. Now, usually you don't do a lot of this here inside the channel box, but I just want to point out that these are remembered, so you could have more precise movement, rotation, and scale. Now, I will show you how to reset these back down to 0 or basically clear these out while maintaining the same transformations on an object. That's for later. But right now, this is useful to know. Now, I talked earlier about channel box and attribute editor. They're very similar to each other. Channel box is going to be your kind of a compressed, condensed view for settings for an object. And then you have the attribute editor that will give you a little bit more detail and options for the object. This is an expanded view of the properties. And if you switch over to attribute editor, you do have a similar set of options. You just have to find the tab that you would use for this. So you can see that if I switch over to a tab for this object under pcube, I get the same translate, rotate, scale, as well as a lot more options for me to go through. To toggle between the attribute editor and the channel box is Control A. This will toggle between the two. Now let me go ahead and delete this and let's start a new object. Let's start with the cube again. And the next set of options I want to show you is going to be ability for you to add different dimensions or scale to an object after you create it, as well as adding some subdivisions or some other options depending on the primitive that you are using. So for a cube, if you select the cube after you create it inside the scene, come over to the channel box and you go under inputs and you left click on this polycube one Depending on the primitive you're creating, this name will be different. So if you left click on this, this will open up a new menu that gives you access to width, height, and depth that allows you to input a number, which will be the size of the cube, as well as adding extra divisions into the geometry, into the primitive. So I'm going to go ahead and let's say I want my cube to be bigger. Instead of scaling it or trying to scale in the channel box or trying to scale inside the viewport, I can come into the input and type in, let's say I want the cube to be bigger. Let's do 5 by 5 by 5. Or maybe let's say I want depth to be 3. So instead of trying to scale this to a specific size, I can come in here and type in the numbers. Now these numbers are in specific units in Maya. We'll talk more about them a little later. But these units are in centimeters. So when I type in 5 by 5 by 3, this is actually 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters by 3 centimeters. But right now, that's just for me to mention, and we'll cover this a little bit more later. So now my cube is bigger, and I can control the size of it by using the input box. And this is kind of actually the way that I tend to start an initial size for a primitive, is by typing in the inputs for the size. And then the other 3 set of options for this cube are subdivisions. This gives you extra segments into the cube. So for example, what if I wanted extra divisions in width? I would just type in, let's say 3. And then if I wanted some divisions in height, say 2, and then maybe depth, let's say 3. So I've increased the size of the cube using the inputs, as well as added extra segments into the cube for me to work with. Each primitive you create will have a different set of inputs for you to work with. So for example, if I create a cylinder and I open up the inputs on the poly cylinder, you can see that the cylinder has radius, it has height, it has subdivision axis and height, and it's just from experience you'll know what these are. But the easiest way to know, for example, for the cylinder, radius is how big the cylinder is, height is the height of the cylinder, subdivision axis is the amount of segments around the cylinder, and subdivision height is the amount of segments in between. And then you have your subdivision caps, which are segments for the top and the bottom. So, and depending on whichever primitive you create, you'll have different set of options you'll have to work through in order to kind of start the object with a lot more segments, different size dimension than what you initially created. Now let me go ahead and move this off to the side a little bit, and let me create another one. So whenever you create a cube, or let's say I create a cylinder, it defaults back to a specific set of dimensions, and all the options are not going to be the same as what I just set for this one. If you want to change how your initial cube or any other primitive gets created right away, let's say you wanted specific amount of segments right away, as well as maybe a specific size. If you go to Create, Polygon Primitives, anytime you see a little box on the side, these are options. An option menu will open up for that function. A lot of the tools in Maya will have this option box. So if you go to Create Polygon Primitives, and let's say I open up the cube options, this will give me access to the options of how I would want this polygon cube to be created every time it gets created inside Maya. So let's say I didn't want the 1 by 1 with all the segments set to 1. Let's say I wanted all segments always to be at 3, and the cube I wanted to be 5 by 5 by 5. Then I hit apply, close it, and now every time I create a cube, it will be created that size, with that many segments, and no matter what I do now, it will be remembered. Now, if I want to go ahead and reset this, I usually don't do this. If I want to reset this back down to default and always create my default cube, you have to go back to Create, Polygon Primitives, go back to that option menu, and to reset settings for any menu, for any option that you have, that you've modified, you go to Edit and you reset settings. Pretty much every single window that has options will have this option for you, so you can just go ahead and reset settings. So this is just a slight adjustment you can make to your primitives or any other menu that you're working in the future. And the last thing I want to cover is the XYZ Gizmo orientation. Let me go ahead and delete everything. Well, actually, almost the last thing. I want to cover a few more things. So the XYZ Gizmo, whenever you create an object, let's recreate that cube, and then you hit W, you will have an XYZ Gizmo show up. This XYZ Gizmo will become very important. You should familiarize yourself with this now, and what letters and what colors and arrow directions mean in terms of you manipulating that object. Again, if you don't see this gizmo, go to the move tool. Otherwise you won't see it, or you might have the rotate or scale. So switch over to the move tool. You'll get the XYZ Gizmo, the arrows. It's a little easier to see. So the blue arrow is your Z axis. Your red arrow is your X axis. And your green arrow is the Y, up and down. So whenever you are creating an object and you're working with an object, you should always orient your scene in a way where the blue arrow is pointing towards you. So that way you know that's the front of the object. And you can always also use the new interactive cube. It will tell you where the front of an object is. So whenever you are creating something that has a direction, and most objects will, such as the front, side, back, you should always be aware, what orientation am I creating this object in? Do I have my viewports aligned before I create? Is the Z axis, the blue arrow, pointing towards me? And it should be. So that way you know that's always going to be the front of the object, that's going to be the back, and the red arrow should always be pointing towards the right. And this also is important because if I start dragging my object up and down, left to right, so for example, let me drag it up. You can take a look at the channel box and you can see the translate Y has been modified on a positive value. That means I'm dragging the object towards the arrow and modifying it and moving it in a positive direction. If I drag it away from the arrow, you can see that I'm modifying and translating that object in a negative value, in an opposite translate movement. Now you can move things left to right and have a negative value, that's fine, but you should always be aware of which direction you're dragging things. Is it in a negative or in positive, away from the arrow, towards the arrow? You should always be aware of all the values and everything you're doing inside Maya that should have specific purpose to it. And that starts with just understanding the XYZ Gizmo and how your scene should be oriented. I see a lot of beginners kind of sometimes flip things over and not realize that you rotated on a different axis. Now your viewport is upside down. And then when you select an object, you can see the Y is pointing down, X is pointing to the left, and you can see the interactive cube is upside down. So this kind of sometimes happens, and you could continue modeling and not realize it, only to realize that whenever you are rendering or exporting this, the object is all of a sudden upside down and it's just not showing up how it shows up inside Maya. So you gotta be very careful and just always start orienting your scene in this manner. And anytime you create your primitive or any object inside the scene, it will always show up inside the world origin, meaning that it will be placed at the 000 world space. This is kind of like the spawning point right here in the center where all the objects are created. And that's where this primitive was created. And everything you create will be right here in the world origin. That's why everything is zeroed out. If you start dragging things away from the world origin, away from the spawn point, you can see that I am now modifying those values. If I start to scale or rotate, I'll have negative and positive, and it all depends on the 000 world space right here. So whenever you are dragging things, always just be aware. That's why you have positive values, that's why you have negative values. They all correspond to this X, Y, Z, and this world origin center. And one more thing about just remembering and orienting yourself inside the scene, just learning what these gizmos mean and what X, Y, Z based on colors are. Easiest way to do this is, again, always enable W so you can see those arrows. And then if you take a look at the bottom left, right here, you will have the same 3 colors and arrows, and the letters appear to help you and show you what is Y, what is Z, and what is X. So if you're not sure, or if you're still kind of trying to remember what those mean, Y, you can see Y right here is the green arrow, up and down. Red is the X, left to right. And Z is front to back, which is blue. For right now, all I want you to remember is whenever you create an object, that doesn't matter where you are inside the scene, just begin to orient and familiarize yourself. Alright, so as soon as I create an object, I need to make sure that I just rotate my camera and I'm looking at the object straight on. Z is pointing towards me, X is pointing to the right, and my Y pointing to the up. So I know that my scene is oriented correctly. And now that you have the interactive cube, you can kind of use it to help you out as well. Now let me talk about how to rename objects. So let me go ahead and just delete this, start fresh. So I'm going to create the cube. I'm going to drag it off to the side. I already have my move tool enabled, W. Let's create a cylinder. Let's move that back. Let's create a sphere. Move it to the side. All right, so I have 3 objects inside the scene. If I select each object and take a look at the channel box, you can see right here at the very top it says P cylinder. It also has the shape, P cylinder shape. Here's the inputs, poly cylinder 1. These are just kind of names that are given to the object as they are created. This right here, right up at the top of the channel box, this is your name of the object. If you select the cube, it's going to be P cube 1. Here's the sphere. If you open up the outliner, you will have the same names appear right here. Now to rename objects, so you can find them easier and you know what they are, it's very easy to rename. All you do is you select the object, come over to the channel box, and you left click on this name. It will become highlighted. And then you can rename it to anything you want. Capital letters and lower letters do matter. So if you're going to keep everything at a specific naming convention, let's say all lower letters, you should stick with that. So Maya does not like having the same object named the same way. So if you try to rename a layer or anything else in the same manner, it will not allow you to. So naming is something that's going to become very important. So that way you have a consistency. So let's say I'm going to rename this all lower letters cylinder, and I've renamed my object. So this is now the name of this object. If I go to the outliner, you can see that it also changed here as well. If I want to rename the cube, I'm going to select the cube, left click, and name cube. If I want to rename it through the outliner, you can do so as well. You just open up the outliner, find the object you want to rename, double click. This will enter you into renaming, and you can rename it here, sphere, and press enter. And now I've renamed all 3 of my objects inside the scene, so I can find them better, and they don't use the default names. And one last thing with working with objects, there's a very, very useful shortcut key to being able to isolate a selection and hide everything that you're not working on and only work on the object that you had selected. So sometimes your scene may get very complex and you just want to isolate and work on one object at a time and not have to see everything else inside the scene. There are multiple ways to do this in Maya, and the most common way that is extremely useful is being able to isolate select. So whenever you select an object, the shortcut key will be Control-1. This will isolate the selected object and hide everything else from you. It's still there, it's just hidden. To bring everything back, you press Control-1 again, and it will bring all the objects back. If I press Control-1, you can see that right here in the toolbar, in the viewport toolbar, Isolate Select becomes enabled. So this is how you can tell if you have something isolated or not, is it'll be highlighted. So Control-1 is your shortcut key. You don't have to have one object, of course. You can have multiple objects and then isolate them. Control-1, it'll hide everything else. Control-1 to bring everything back. Super useful shortcut and one that will be used a lot. In the next video of Maya Foundation Module 1 series, we'll cover Object Component Mode and how to work with objects' vertices, edges, and faces.